My name is Vivian Adler. I am 38-year-old. I want to start by saying that I am not a person who cries easily. I didn't cry when my business partner stole 4 years of my research and published it under his name. I didn't cry when I was evicted from my apartment in February with a 3-year-old on my hip and $14 in my checking account. I didn't cry at my own mother's kitchen table when she told me, to my face, that I had wasted every single thing God had ever given me. I swallowed all of that. I put it in a box somewhere deep in my chest, where I keep things that are too large and too ugly to take out in polite company. But when my daughter Zoe called me on a Tuesday evening in November, her voice trembling with something that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but was the exact midpoint between the two, and told me what my parents had said to her, what they had actually said to a 14-year-old child about her own mother, I sat down on the floor of a hotel hallway in Seattle, and I cried like I had not cried since I was 16 years old. Sitting in the back of a police cruiser in the parking lot of a church in Harwick, Ohio, waiting for my father's name to become public. That night, somewhere between Zoe crying and me crying and both of us eventually laughing in that exhausted, helpless way that only happens after real pain, she told me what she had done. And I want to tell you about it, all of it, because this story does not begin in a hotel hallway in Seattle, and it does not begin with a Wikipedia page on a living room television. It begins a very long time ago in a very small town, and it is about things that take a lifetime to understand. Harwick, Ohio is the kind of town that is proud of itself for no reason that would survive scrutiny. Population 6,412 when I was growing up there, though that number has since declined to somewhere around 5,000 because the young people who have options tend to leave, and the ones who don't have options tend to stay and quietly disappear into themselves. It has a main street with a pharmacy, a diner called The Griddle that has not changed its menu since 1987, a post office, a hardware store, 3 churches, and a library that is only open on Tuesdays and Thursdays because of budget cuts that have been ongoing since before I was born. My father, Harold Adler, ran the hardware store, Adler's Hardware. It had been his father's store before him and his grandfather's store before that, and the weight of that lineage sat on Harold Adler's shoulders the way a yoke sits on an ox, not ornamental, not chosen, just there, bending him forward, pulling him down into the earth a little more with every decade that passed. He was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, deliberately, with pleasure in it. He was cruel the way a frost is cruel. It doesn't hate the flower, it simply moves across the ground with complete indifference to what it kills. My mother, Beverly Adler, was a different kind of difficult. Where my father's criticism was cold, my mother's was warm and suffocating, the kind that comes wrapped in concern and maternal love, and a bafflement so genuine it makes you want to apologize for existing. She volunteered at the church. She made casseroles for sick neighbors. She organized the 4th of July parade every year with a ferocious competence that would have made her excellent in almost any professional capacity, but which she directed entirely at civic volunteerism, because that was what women like her did in towns like Harwick in the era she had grown up in. She loved me, I believe, in the truest sense of the word. She just had no idea what to do with me, and rather than admit that, she decided that the problem was me. I was the kind of child that makes certain kinds of parents nervous. I read constantly. I asked too many questions. I took apart the kitchen radio when I was 7 to see how it worked and then put it back together correctly, which impressed my father for approximately 48 hours before he decided it had been an accident. I won the regional science fair 3 years in a row with projects that my teachers helped me scale down because the original concepts were, according to my 5th grade teacher Mrs. Portman, a little ambitious for the materials we have available. I did not have a single friend until I was 9 years old, because I did not know how to pretend to be less than I was, and children are viciously accurate readers of inauthenticity. None of this made my parents proud in the way I needed them to be proud. It made them uneasy. Pride in Harwick was calibrated to specific achievements: sports trophies, homecoming court, acceptance to a state school, marriage to a respectable person, a steady job. I was achieving things that had no frame in their world, and rather than build a new frame, they decided the things I was achieving were somehow beside the point. You spend too much time in your head, my mother told me approximately 9,000 times throughout my childhood. Real life happens out here, Vivian. With people, you have to learn to be with people. What she meant, I eventually understood, was that I made her feel inadequate, not intentionally, not maliciously. Simply by existing in a way she didn't understand, I reflected something back at her that she didn't want to see. And so the most efficient solution was to suggest that the problem was my head, not her inability to understand what was in it. My father said less. He operated in a register of silence that was louder than most people's words. He would look at my report cards, straight A's, every single one, through all 12 years of school, and then set them down on the counter and nod once, the way you nod at a weather report that confirms what you already knew. There was no joy in it. There was no warmth. There was acknowledgement, and then there was the return to whatever he had been doing before. I want to be clear, I loved my parents. I still love them, in the complicated, grief-stained way that you love people who shaped you badly. You cannot choose the people who form you, and you cannot unbe formed by them once they have done it. What you can do is spend the rest of your life trying to understand it, and then trying to put something better in its place. But I am getting ahead of myself, because before any of the rest of this story can make sense, I have to tell you about the thing that happened when I was 16, the thing that split my life into a before and an after, as cleanly as a crack running through stone. My father managed the finances for 3 different civic organizations in Harwick: the Rotary Club, the Veterans Memorial Fund, and the St. Augustine's Community Outreach Fund, which was attached to our church. He did this because he was trusted. Harold Adler was the kind of man that small towns trust: established, quiet, responsible, a third-generation business owner whose name was on a building. Trust in small towns is transitive. It passes from generation to generation like a surname. I found out what he was doing by accident. I was 16, and I was looking for a stamp in his home office because I needed to mail my application to the Ohio Young Scholars Program, which was a 2-week summer program at Ohio State University for academically exceptional students. And I was so excited about it that I was mailing it 3 weeks before the deadline because I couldn't stand to have it sit in the house any longer. I found the stamps in the middle drawer of his desk, and when I pulled the drawer open, I also found a spiral notebook, the kind he kept for his personal accounting, because my father distrusted computers and kept his financial records by hand. I should not have looked, I know that, but the notebook fell open when I took it out to get to the stamps, and numbers are the kind of thing my brain processes without permission. I saw the columns, I saw the amounts, I saw the names of the accounts, and I saw, with the quiet, terrible clarity of a mind that is very good at pattern recognition, exactly what he was doing. He had been diverting small amounts from the St. Augustine's Community Outreach Fund for approximately 2 years. Not large amounts, never large amounts because large amounts attract attention. $50 here, $80 there, once $140. Over 2 years it added up to approximately $3,200. I stood in his home office for what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds. Then I put the notebook back, took the stamp, and went to my room. I did not mail the application that day. I did not mail it for 3 weeks, and by the time I did, I had already decided that I was not going to tell anyone what I had seen. My father was my father. He ran the hardware store. He sat in the same pew at St. Augustine's every Sunday and shook hands with Pastor William Gentry after the service. He had a name on a building. I told myself there must be an explanation. I told myself that I had misread the columns. I told myself a great many things that I did not actually believe because the alternative was too large and too ugly to hold. I also confronted him. Once, on a Thursday evening in March when my mother was at her book club and my younger brother Danny was at baseball practice, I sat down across from him at the kitchen table and I said very quietly, "Dad, I saw the notebook in your desk." He looked at me for a very long time. My father was not a man who showed fear. I had never seen it on his face before that moment, and the sight of it was so disorienting that I had to look away. Then he said, "You're mistaken about what you saw." "I'm not," I said. Another long silence. Then, "I'm going to fix it. I'm already in the process of fixing it. Don't go anywhere with this, Vivian, you understand me. There are things at stake that you don't understand." I understood exactly what was at stake. His reputation, our family's standing in Harwick, the store, Danny's place on the baseball team and the social world that came with it, my mother's position at the church and the Tuesday dinners and the 4th of July parade, and every single piece of the life she had built. I said, "You need to pay it back, all of it." He said, "I will." He didn't. He was 11 months from finishing paying it back. I found the notebook again accidentally in a different hiding spot, when Pastor Gentry hired a new church treasurer who did an independent audit and found the discrepancy. By that time I was 17, 4 months from graduation, with early acceptance to the University of Michigan on a full academic scholarship, and a future that was finally beginning to look like something I could live in. My father came to me before he went to the police. I don't know how I knew he was going to turn himself in, perhaps because, beneath everything, Harold Adler was not actually the man I feared he was. Perhaps because even a man who does something wrong can still, in the final moment, choose to do the right thing. He sat across from me in my bedroom, which was covered in periodic table posters and a hand-drawn map of the human brain I had made from a textbook, and he looked at his hands and said, very quietly, "I'm going to tell them everything." I said, "I know." He looked up, "You've known for a year." 11 months, I said. He put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. My father was not a man who cried. He simply sat with his face in his hands for a long moment, and then he put his hands down and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before and have never seen since. It was something between gratitude and devastation. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was the only time in my life my father apologized to me." "I know," I said again. The scandal in Harwick was, by the standards of actual scandal, quite modest. $3,200 returned, a public apology, 12 months of community service, no prison time because Pastor Gentry intervened on his behalf, which tells you something about the kind of man William Gentry was, or perhaps about the way small towns protect their own. The hardware store survived, Danny's baseball career survived, my mother's Tuesday dinners survived. What did not survive was my scholarship to the University of Michigan. My father's legal fees depleted the family savings entirely. There was talk of selling the store, which thankfully did not come to pass, but in the months of uncertainty I was asked, not directly, never directly, because my parents were not people who could make a direct request, if I could consider deferring for a year, maybe 2, and taking courses at the community college while the family found its feet. I was asked this in the language of suggestion and gentle sighing, and my mother's particular way of crying, that was not quite crying, but was designed to produce the same result. I deferred. 1 year became 2, became 3, became effectively never. I want to be careful here because I am not writing this to paint myself as a martyr. I made choices. All of them were my choices, even the ones that felt like they were being made for me. What I am saying is that the trajectory of my life was altered, substantially and permanently, by an event I had no part in creating, and that the people responsible for that alteration have spent the subsequent 2 decades telling me, in various ways, that I never had the potential that the University of Michigan apparently saw in me. If that sounds bitter, I promise you it is not, or rather it was for a very long time and then it became something else. I'll tell you about that in a while. The Harwick Community College years are a chapter I usually skip when I tell my own story. Not because they were bad, they were not entirely bad, but because they have the quality of a holding pattern, a place where a life is suspended while waiting to become itself, and there is something melancholy about suspended things. I took courses in biology and chemistry and mathematics, which I was extraordinarily good at, and I worked 3 days a week at the Harwick Public Library, which was only open on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but needed someone to come in and catalogue the new acquisitions on Mondays and Wednesdays and Saturdays. I was very good at cataloguing. I found the system of it satisfying, the way everything had a place, the way a number could tell you exactly where something lived. It was the first time I understood, in a physical, embodied way, what it meant to build a system that other people could use. I also met at the community college a woman named Nora Vashti, who was taking biology on the path to nursing school, and who became, over the following 2 decades, the person I would call first in any crisis, the person whose voice I most needed to hear in any moment of genuine darkness, and the closest thing I have ever had to a sister. Nora was warm in the way I was not, which is to say that she moved through the world with her heart visibly present in a way I had learned to prevent. She laughed loudly and was not embarrassed by it. She said exactly what she was thinking with a directness I found initially startling and then deeply comforting. She was the first person who ever looked at me, at the real architecture of who I was, not the performance of it, and said, without hesitation, "You are remarkable and you are wasting yourself in this town, and I am going to be your friend whether you cooperate or not." I said, "You don't know anything about me." She said, "I know that you finished that exam 40 minutes before anyone else, and then spent the remaining time rereading it twice to check for errors, and then, when you were sure, you sat back in your chair and went somewhere inside your head that none of the rest of us could follow. That tells me quite a lot. I transferred to Ohio State after 2 years on a merit scholarship that covered most of my tuition, worked part-time in the university library, and graduated with a degree in biomedical engineering 3 years later, summa cum laude, with a thesis on predictive modeling for early-stage pathology detection that my advisor, a man named Professor Leonard Osai, told me was the most sophisticated work I have seen from an undergraduate in 15 years. Professor Osai was a short, meticulous Ghanaian man with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead and a habit of making tea in a ceramic pot he kept on his office windowsill. He was the first person in a position of actual professional authority who looked at what I was doing and recognized it without qualifications. No for a girl, no for someone from a community college, no given your background, just recognition, clean and complete. I wept in my car after our first real meeting, where he had gone through my thesis chapter by chapter and told me in specific technical terms what was working and what was extraordinary. I wept because I had been waiting for that kind of recognition my entire life, and I had almost given up believing it would come. He helped me apply to graduate programs. He wrote letters that, he told me later, described me in terms usually reserved for once-in-a-decade students. I was accepted to the joint MD-PhD program at Johns Hopkins. I called my parents to tell them. My mother said, "Baltimore, that's so far, why can't you stay closer to home?" My father said, "Medicine is a good, stable field." Neither of them said congratulations. Neither of them asked about the program, the research, the scholarship. My mother pivoted quickly to telling me about my cousin Dana's engagement, which had happened the previous weekend. And I sat on the phone listening to the description of Dana's ring for 4 minutes, and then said I had to go. I called Nora immediately after. She answered on the first ring, heard my voice and said, "What happened?" I told her about Hopkins. She screamed, loudly, genuinely, with complete abandon. She was in her nursing program by then, 2 states away, and she screamed so loudly that I heard someone in the background ask if she was okay. She screamed and then she said, "Vivianadler, you magnificent, ridiculous genius," and I started crying again, but this time from something that was not grief. Here is where the story gets harder. I need to tell you about Philip Whitmore. I met Philip in the 3rd year of my PhD program. He was 2 years ahead of me, finishing his own doctorate in computer science, a lean, angular man from Connecticut, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a childhood in which your abilities were never questioned by the people who were supposed to love you. He was brilliant, genuinely. I want to say that because the betrayal I am about to describe will make you want to take his intelligence away, and you shouldn't, because it wasn't his intelligence that was the problem. It was his character, and those are separate things. We became research partners in the way that sometimes happens at universities, through proximity and mutual recognition, and the particular intimacy of working on a hard problem together at 2 in the morning with bad coffee and no one else around. We were trying to build a diagnostic algorithm that could identify markers for rare metabolic disorders in children from routine blood panel data. The idea was mine. The initial framework was mine. Philip came in with the machine learning architecture that would make it scalable, and for a while, it was one of the best collaborations of my life. We also became something more than research partners, briefly, which I am including here because it matters to the texture of the betrayal that came later. We were together for about 8 months. It ended because Philip wanted things from a relationship that I was not capable of giving, not then, not at that point in my life, and I ended it as honestly as I could, and he took it, I thought at the time, reasonably well. We continued working together. This was, in retrospect, the decision I look back on with the most regret, not because it was wrong in principle, but because I trusted his professionalism over my instincts, and my instincts had been trying to tell me something for months. In the spring of my 5th year, I presented an early version of our algorithm, which we were calling the Adler-Whitmore diagnostic model, because I had insisted on alphabetical order, and he had agreed without complaint at a small internal symposium. The response was very good. Professor Ose took me aside afterward and told me that he thought this work was publishable in one of the top 3 journals in the field and that we should begin preparing the manuscript. 2 months later, Philip Whitmore submitted the manuscript, without me, under his name alone, to a different journal than the one Professor Osai had suggested, a reputable journal, not a predatory one, which somehow made it worse. He submitted it as Philip Whitmore, sole author, with the model renamed the Whitmore Diagnostic Framework, and by the time I found out, it had already been accepted for peer review. The next 3 months are not something I can describe in linear terms, because they do not exist in my memory that way. They exist as a series of images. The expression on Professor Osai's face when I told him, the university's legal office, a room with very bad lighting and 2 women who were kind but technically constrained. Philip, in a meeting I requested and he could not refuse without making himself look worse, telling me that the core intellectual contribution was always the machine learning architecture, and that my role had been primarily conceptual. The documentation I had, emails, timestamped notes, a version-controlled shared drive that was, blessedly, preserved in full, that told a completely different story. The long, slow process of formal complaint and investigation, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having to prove, in institutional settings, that the work you did was actually yours. The investigation took 11 months. Philip's paper was ultimately retracted. He was asked to leave the program. The model was subsequently published, jointly, in a journal that was better than the one he had chosen, with both our names on it, mine first, because the department agreed that the intellectual origin was mine, and because Professor Osai had spent those 11 months being a ferocious and unwavering advocate in a way that I will honor for the rest of my life. Philip went to industry. I heard about him occasionally over the following years. He did well, which is the infuriating truth about people who do things like what Philip did. The world is not organized around justice. It does not automatically punish the right people or reward the right people. It simply moves forward, and you either move with it or you don't. What I lost was not the credit. Credit was restored eventually, imperfectly. What I lost was time and trust, and a period of my life that should have been characterized by the pure forward momentum of early career research, but was instead characterized by institutional limbo, and a kind of loneliness that is specific to that experience. The loneliness of knowing that something was done to you that was real and serious, and spending months in a world that moves slowly and skeptically around such claims. I also, and this is a small detail that became a large detail later, I fell behind in my program. The investigation ate the time that should have gone to my dissertation. I graduated later than I expected. I arrived on the academic job market 2 years behind schedule, at a moment when the market was unkind, and the first position I was offered was not the research university appointment I had imagined, but a postdoctoral fellowship at a small medical center in Columbus, Ohio. I came home, not to Harwick, never to Harwick, but to Ohio, which felt close enough to being a regression that I had to work actively not to interpret it that way. I called my parents to tell them I was moving to Columbus. My mother said, "Oh, that's closer, you should come for Sunday dinners." My father asked whether the fellowship came with benefits. I had not told them about Philip. I have never told them about Philip, not in full. I told them there had been a complication with research attribution that had delayed my graduation. My mother said that sounded like I had been careless. I let her believe that. Zoe was not planned. I want to say that clearly and without apology, because there is a culture of softening that sentence, surprise, people say, or unexpected blessing. And while Zoe is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened in my life, the circumstances of her arrival were not soft. I was 31 in the postdoc, barely keeping my financial head above water, in a relationship with a man named Patrick Osai. No relation to Professor Osai, though I admit the rhyme of it gave me pause, who was a genuinely good person in all the ways that do not ultimately overcome the fundamental incompatibility of 2 people who want entirely different things from their lives. Patrick wanted to get married and stay in Columbus and build a life that was stable and predictable, and filled with the kinds of weekend rituals that make a life feel like a home. I wanted to work and travel and keep my options permanently open and not be held to a geography or a schedule that was not of my own choosing. These are not moral positions. Neither of us was right. We were simply not the same kind of person, and we tried for 2 years to pretend that this was a solvable problem, and then I got pregnant, and then we tried for another 8 months to pretend that it would be fine, and then we both told the truth and Patrick moved to Portland, and I stayed in Columbus with a 4-month-old daughter and a postdoc stipend that was, even at its most generous, not designed for single parenthood. Zoe Adler, born on a Wednesday morning in April. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces and had her father's eyes and my jaw and a determination from the very first hours of her life that has never once wavered. She cried exactly twice in the hospital, once when she came out, and once when they weighed her, and both times the cry was so precise and so indignant that the nurse laughed and said, "This one knows what she wants." That has been true every single day since. I loved her immediately, which surprised me. I am not a person who came easily to love, I had to learn it slowly. From people like Nora and Professor Osai, from the experience of being seen and found worthy of seeing, I had not expected to hold a 7-pound, 4-ounce human being and feel, without any ambivalence, that this was the realest thing I had ever done. But I did. I felt it with complete conviction. And then I went home to my 2-bedroom apartment and sat on the floor of the 2nd bedroom, which I had furnished with a crib and a changing table and a small bookshelf that I had already filled with board books, and I thought about how, specifically, I was going to do this. The postdoc ended 6 months after Zoe was born. The research centre did not renew it, not for punitive reasons, but because the grant cycle ended and the money ran out, which is the structural reality of academic research funding and has nothing to do with my work, which was by that point generating results that 3 different institutions had expressed interest in. But interest in academic research does not pay rent in the present tense. I found adjunct teaching positions at 2 different colleges in Columbus, which together paid slightly more than the postdoc had. I did freelance consulting on a biomedical database project. I took Zoe in her carrier to the library on my days off and worked on my research there, because the library had free Wi-Fi and an acceptable noise level, and Zoe, from a very early age, was a library child. She sat quietly and looked around with enormous observant eyes and did not disturb anyone. When she started talking, she developed entirely on her own a library voice, a small indoor whisper she used automatically when we walked through the doors, which I considered to be one of the clearest signs that I had made at least one right decision in my life. I will not enumerate in detail the full texture of those 3 years, because to do so would take longer than I have, and because what matters is not the specific inventory of difficulty. The $14 month, the February eviction. The night I sat in an emergency room with Zoe at 18 months, because she had a fever of 104, and I did not have a pediatrician yet, and I did the math 3 times in the waiting room, and determined that I could cover the copay if I did not eat anything except rice and peanut butter for the following 12 days, which I did, but the fact that I came through it. We came through it, Zoe and I, the way you come through things when you don't have the option of not coming through them. You keep moving because stopping is not available to you, and then, eventually, if you are very lucky and very stubborn, forward motion becomes its own kind of momentum. I submitted the diagnostic algorithm, the one that had been the center of the Philip catastrophe, substantially expanded and refined over the intervening years, to a biomedical engineering journal in the spring of the year Zoe turned 3. It was accepted with minor revisions. Professor Osai, who had become a full professor and department chair by this point, and who still made tea in a ceramic pot on his windowsill, wrote to me when it was published and said, "This is the work you were always going to do. I'm glad it found its way out." The algorithm was picked up by a consortium of children's hospitals in the Midwest that had been looking for exactly this kind of tool. It was the kind of pickup that does not make news, but makes a very specific, very important kind of difference. The kind where, in a hospital somewhere, a child gets a diagnosis faster than they would have otherwise, and that child's family has more time, more options, better information. Over the following year, I got emails from 3 different physicians whose patients had been diagnosed using my model. One of them, a pediatric metabolic specialist in Cincinnati, described a 4-year-old girl who would very likely have been misdiagnosed for another 2 years without it. I printed that email and I put it in Zoe's baby book, right after the photo of her first library visit. A venture capital firm in Pittsburgh reached out in the fall of that year. They were interested in funding the development of a commercial diagnostic platform built on the model, not just the algorithm itself, but a full system that could be implemented across hospital networks. I negotiated that conversation for 6 months while still adjuncting and consulting, with Nora on the phone every Sunday evening helping me understand what I was worth and not let anyone tell me otherwise. I signed the term sheet in February. By June, I had an office, a team of 4, and a salary that was the first compensation in my adult life that was commensurate with what I was actually doing. The company was called Adler Diagnostics. I named it after myself deliberately without apology, for reasons that should by now be clear. The years between Zoe's 3rd birthday and Zoe's 14th birthday are the chapter of my life I love the most. They are not without difficulty. Building a company is always difficult, and I will spare you the operational details of those early years because this is not a business memoir, but they have a quality of forward motion and chosen difficulty that makes them entirely different from the difficulties that came before. You can bear almost anything that you have chosen. Adler Diagnostics grew. The platform was adopted by hospital networks in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and eventually 11 states. We expanded the diagnostic capability beyond metabolic disorders, rare genetic conditions, early-onset autoimmune markers, pediatric cardiac anomalies. I hired slowly and carefully, building a team that was, by the time we reached 40 employees, one of the most cross-disciplinary groups I have ever seen. Engineers, physicians, ethicists, patient advocates, data scientists, a philosopher who specialized in medical epistemology and who I have never once regretted hiring. We received our 2nd round of funding in our 3rd year and our 3rd in our 5th. In the 7th year, we were acquired by a larger health technology company, not absorbed, the way acquisitions can sometimes mean absorption, but structured to preserve the research independence I had insisted on in negotiation, which Nora will tell you took 3 months and nearly ended twice. The acquisition made me financially secure in a way that I still do not have an internal map for, because my internal map was made in the years when $14 was a number with genuine stakes, and that map does not update easily. I bought a house in a neighborhood of Columbus with old trees and good schools, and a library 3 blocks away. I bought Zoe every book she wanted. I hired a housekeeper named Sandra Kwan, who was more organized than I am and kinder than she needed to be, and who became, over time, part of the fabric of our daily life in the way that certain people do, quietly essential. I started sleeping more than 5 hours a night. Zoe grew up in this house, she grew up in this chapter, she grew up watching me work and fail and try again. She grew up accompanying me to hospitals and research centers, and once, memorably, to a congressional briefing on diagnostic technology in pediatric medicine, where she sat in the gallery in a blue dress and watched with the same enormous, observant eyes she had used in the library at 8 months, and afterward asked me 3 questions about the hearing that were, by any measure, better questions than the ones asked by the majority of the congresspeople present. She was kind, Zoe. This is the thing I marvel at most because I was not kind at her age. I was sharp and defended and trying so hard to build a self that could withstand the things that were happening to it. Zoe had none of that. She was open in the way that only children who have been loved without conditions can be open. She befriended the quietest children in her class, the ones on the margins, with a precision that made me wonder if she had some internal compass that oriented automatically toward the lonely. She brought things home, once a stray cat, once a box of damaged books from a school recycling pile, once a 12-year-old boy named Ferdinand who had missed the school bus and had no phone and needed a ride home to a neighborhood 40 minutes from ours. She did all of this without calculation or performance. It was simply the way she moved through the world. She also knew about me. She knew what I did and why I did it and something of the road I had traveled to get there. Not everything, not Philip, not the church fund, not the $14 a month, those are stories she was not old enough for, but the shape of it, the fact that the road had been long and sometimes very hard and that I had walked it anyway. She knew this and it was in her, in the way she looked at people who were struggling, in the care she took with difficult things. Nora once said, "Zoe is what happens when someone like you survives." I had to sit with that for a long time before I understood it. Now I have to tell you about my parents. My parents and I maintained a relationship throughout these years that I would describe as functional, periodic, and carefully managed. I saw them at Christmas and occasionally in the summer. I called my mother every 2 weeks, 15-minute calls, during which she updated me on Harwick news and asked after Zoe and steered around any topic that might require her to engage with who I actually was. I called my father less frequently because our conversations were shorter and more painful, consisting primarily of silences interrupted by brief factual exchanges. I brought Zoe to Harwick for her first visit when she was 2, and the sight of my mother holding her granddaughter was one of those moments that collapses complexity into simple warmth, however briefly. Beverly Adler loved Zoe immediately and completely, in the uncomplicated way she had never quite managed with me, perhaps because Zoe was not her daughter, and therefore not a reflection of anything, just a small person to love. My father held Zoe with the careful, tentative movements of a man who is afraid of breaking something, and Zoe looked up at him with that enormous equanimity of hers, and grabbed his thumb with both hands, and his face did something I had not seen it do in years. Over time they became grandparents in a way they had never quite been parents. Zoe visited them in the summers, sometimes for a week at a time. She helped in the hardware store, which Harold still ran, smaller now with 1 employee instead of 3, but still there, still his. She liked it, she liked the orderliness of it, the physical logic of nuts and bolts and screws and the specific places they were kept. She and my father had conversations there in that store that I suspect were different from any conversation he had ever had. Zoe had a way of meeting people where they were without agenda. I told myself this was good. I told myself that my parents were good for Zoe even if they had been, in certain important ways, not good for me. I told myself that relationships are not monolithic, that a person can fail one person and succeed with another, and that Zoe's experience of them did not have to be mine. I believed this mostly, but I had not sufficiently accounted for the fact that Harold and Beverly Adler were, at their core, the same people they had always been, and the same people can always do the same things. In September, Zoe was assigned a genealogy project for her 8th grade social studies class. The project required students to interview family members and create a family history document. She was excited about it. Zoe is excited about most projects, especially ones that involve research and documentation, which, again, I cannot help but take some credit for. She asked me dozens of questions over several weeks and took careful notes, and she asked me if she could call Nana and Grandpa Adler to ask them questions too, because she wanted multiple perspectives. I said yes, of course I said yes. She called them on a Saturday morning in October, when I was in the study finishing a paper I had been asked to submit to a medical journal on the 2nd-generation version of our diagnostic model. I could hear her on the phone in the kitchen, asking the prepared questions from her interview guide. What was your life like growing up? What was the most important thing that ever happened to you? What was my mom like as a child? I heard her laugh at something my mother said. I heard the specific quality of her listening, the silence on her end that means she is taking notes. I went back to my paper. 20 minutes later, she came to the doorway of my study. I noticed her expression before I noticed that she had stopped talking, the call was over, and she was standing in the doorway with something careful on her face, the look of someone who has received information they don't know what to do with. You okay? I said. Yeah, she said. She paused. Mom, did you know Grandpa got in trouble for something when you were little, with the church? I set down my pen. Did they tell you about that? Grandma mentioned it. She said it was a hard time. Zoe paused again. She also said she thought you could have handled it better, that you were difficult during that time. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was watching me with those eyes of hers, careful, attentive, measuring. Grandma has a particular way of remembering things, I said. Most people do. She said you always made things harder than they needed to be, Zoe said. She was not being cruel, she was reporting, faithfully, the things she had been told. She said you were very smart but you didn't always use it wisely. I nodded slowly. What else did they say? Zoe hesitated. Grandpa said you were a disappointment. The word landed in the room and stayed there. My father's word, travelling through 2 phone connections and my daughter's careful, honest memory, arriving in my study on a Saturday in October. He said that, I said. Not exactly to me, Zoe said quickly. I don't think he realised I could hear him. Grandma put the phone down to get something and Grandpa said something to her and I heard him say, he said your name, and that you had always been a disappointment. She paused. He said it like it wasn't even a big thing, like it was just a fact. I turned back to my paper. I was quiet for a moment, then I said, come here. She came and sat on the edge of the desk. I looked at her. What your grandfather thinks about me is one true thing among many true things, I said. It is not the most important true thing. Do you understand me? She nodded, but her eyes were doing something complicated. Zoe, are you okay? I'm okay, she said. I don't understand how they don't know, how they can just say that and not know. Know what? She gestured at me, at the room, at everything. No, any of it, everything you've done, how do they not know? Because I never told them, I said. Because we don't talk about it. because it matters to me in a different way than it would matter to them, and I've never needed them to know in order to know it myself. She was quiet for a while, then she said, "That seems lonely." I didn't have an answer for that. In November of that same year, the year Zoe was 14, she went to visit Harold and Beverly in Harwick for a long weekend. I was going to a conference in Seattle, and the timing worked out such that she could take the bus to Harwick and I would pick her up on my way back from the airport. She was old enough to travel alone. She had done it before. My parents were, despite everything, physically safe people who loved her and would feed her properly and make her a bed with good blankets. I kissed her goodbye at the bus station on Thursday morning and told her I'd see her Sunday. The conference was good. I presented the second-generation model data to an international audience of about 400, and the questions from the floor were the kind that keep you up at night in a good way, genuinely probing, genuinely engaged, the questions of people who understand what you have done and are already thinking about what comes next. A journalist named Iris Calloway, from a health technology publication, asked if she could profile me for a longer piece she was working on about women in biomedical diagnostics. I said yes. We had coffee the following morning and talked for 2 hours. I did not think about my parents at all for those 2 days, which was not unusual. They lived in a compartment I kept sealed when I was working, which was most of the time. Tuesday evening, November, I was in the hotel hallway because the Wi-Fi in my room had dropped, and I had stepped out to take a call that turned out to be a scheduling issue I could have handled in 30 seconds. My phone rang again as I was heading back. It was Zoe. "Hi baby, how's Harwick?" Her voice, the quality of it, that's what I told you at the beginning, that particular midpoint between anger and hurt. "Mom," she said and stopped. "Zoe, what happened?" A pause, then, "Grandpa said it again today to my face. He wasn't trying to be mean, I don't think. It was just we were talking about school and I told him about the genealogy project and about all the stuff I'd learned and I told him you had helped me understand some things and he shook his head and he said, 'Your mother could have been so much more if she hadn't wasted herself.' And Grandma was right there and she nodded." I sat down on the floor of the hallway. "And then he said, 'Mom,' he said, 'she was always a disappointment. She had chances most people don't get and she threw them away. I love her but I don't know where it went wrong.' I want to describe for you what it is like to hear your own father say that about you to your 14-year-old daughter. I want to give you the exact sensation of it, but I don't think language gets there. There is something that happens in the body, a kind of contraction, a going inward, that is not quite pain and not quite grief, and is both of those things and something older than either." "What did you say?" I asked. "I didn't say anything," Zoe said. "Not right then, I went to my room." "Okay," I said. "Okay, that was the right thing." "Mom," her voice was steadier now, moving out of hurt and into something more resolute. "Mom, they don't know, they genuinely they don't know any of it. They don't know about the algorithm or the company or any of it. They don't even know you have a Wikipedia page." "I know," I said, "I've never." "Can I show them?" she said. I stopped. "Can I show them?" she said again. "Tonight at dinner, I want to show them, not to be mean to them. I don't want to make them feel bad, I promise. I can't sit here and let them think that about you. I can't do it. I can't eat dinner and nod and let them keep saying it. Can I show them?" I was quiet for a very long moment. I thought about many things in that moment. About what it would mean, about whether it was the right thing, about my father's face when I told him I had seen the notebook, about my mother at the kitchen table telling me I made things harder than they needed to be, about Zoe at 14, already knowing exactly who she was in a way I was still learning at 38. I said, "Zoe, I need you to promise me something first." "Okay. If you do this, you do it gently. Not as a weapon, not to win. You show them because you want them to understand, not because you want them to feel ashamed. Can you do that?" A brief silence, then, "Yes, I can do that." "Then yes," I said, "you can show them." Zoe told me what happened after. She told me in the phone call that night, and then again on Sunday when I picked her up at the bus station, and then in pieces over the following weeks as she processed it. So what I am going to tell you now is assembled from all of those versions, which are very consistent with each other because Zoe is a precise and faithful reporter. She came downstairs before dinner on Tuesday evening. My parents were in the living room, my father in his chair, my mother on the couch. The television was on, which it usually was at that hour. Harold and Beverly watched the evening news and then a game show, and then, if nothing better was on, whatever nature documentary was available. Zoe sat down across from them. She had her phone in her hand. "Grandpa," she said, "can I show you something on the TV?" My father looked up from the news. "What is it?" "I want to show you something about Mom," Zoe said. "Can I use the TV?" My father and mother exchanged a look, the specific look that older couples have, the one that is its own language. Then my father picked up the remote and handed it to her without a word. Zoe knew how to use their smart TV because she had helped them set it up during a previous visit. She opened the browser, navigated to Wikipedia, and typed in my name. She told me that her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was completely steady, which is consistent with who she is. All her emotion goes somewhere internal while her surface stays calm. The Wikipedia page for Vivian Adler loaded on their television screen. It was a page that existed, I should tell you, not because I had created it or requested it or promoted it, but because it had been created by editors after the publication of a profile in a major magazine, the kind of profile that gets written when your work has reached a certain scale of impact. I had not read my own Wikipedia page very often. It made me uncomfortable in the way that most third-person descriptions of yourself make you uncomfortable. The feeling that the person being described is and isn't you, that the narrative is accurate but somehow strange. On Harold and Beverly Adler's television, in their living room in Harwick, Ohio, my Wikipedia page was considerably larger than their usual television content. Zoe read it to them. She read the whole page. She started at the top. Vivian Ruth Adler, American biomedical engineer, diagnostics entrepreneur, and author. She is best known for developing the Adler Diagnostic Framework, a machine learning-based clinical decision support system used in over 300 hospital networks across 32 states to assist in the early identification of rare pediatric disorders. Adler Diagnostics, the company she founded, was acquired in year for a figure that I am going to decline to write here, because some things are private and this is not a financial disclosure document. She is the author of the memoir, What the Numbers Told Me, published in year, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award nomination and was on the New York Times bestseller list for 11 weeks. She read the section on education, Ohio State, Johns Hopkins, the early research, the initial publication in the Journal of Pediatric Biomedicine. She read the section on Adler Diagnostics, its founding, its growth, the hospital network adoption, the specific medical categories addressed. She read the section on impact, which included the statistic that the model had been used in the diagnosis of over 14,000 children across its operational history, and that in a significant percentage of cases, the speed of diagnosis was clinically meaningful, that it changed what physicians could do and when. She read the section on the book. She read the quote from the Book Critics Circle Nomination Committee, which described the memoir as a reckoning with scientific ambition, institutional failure, and the quiet, lifelong cost of being exceptional in places that are not built for exceptional people. She read the acknowledgement section, which mentioned Professor Leonard Osai by name as a mentor and advocate. She read the section on awards and recognition. My mother, Zoe told me, began crying about 4 minutes in, quietly with her hand over her mouth, the specific posture of someone who is crying and trying not to be seen doing it. My father did not cry. My father does not cry. What my father did, Zoe told me, was go very still. The stillness that I know from his face at moments of reckoning, the same stillness as that Thursday evening when I told him I had seen the notebook. He went still, and he watched the television with an expression that Zoe described carefully, as like he was looking at something that had always been there, and he was only just seeing it. Zoe read to the end of the page, then she put the remote down. No one said anything for a long moment. Then my mother said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "I didn't know." And my father said, and this is the part that made me cry in the hotel hallway, and cry again at the bus station, and cry a third time when I was alone in the kitchen making tea the night after I picked her up, my father said very quietly, like he was telling a truth he had been holding for a long time. "Of course you didn't. She never told us. She never came home and told us." There was a silence after that, and then my father said to Zoe in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "She got there. She actually got there." Zoe said, "She got there a long time ago, Grandpa." I am going to stop here and tell you about the twist, Because this story has won, and I think you need to know it now, before I tell you what happened when I called my parents. The journalist who wrote the magazine profile that led to my Wikipedia page, the profile that eventually led to the book, because a publisher read the profile and reached out, which is how, what the numbers told me, came to exist. Her name was Iris Calloway. She was the same Iris Calloway who approached me at the conference in Seattle and asked if she could write about me. I recognized her name when she introduced herself. I had not seen it in years, but I recognized it. Because Iris Calloway was someone I had met when she was 17 years old and I was 29, in the parking lot of a CVS in Columbus at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. She had been sitting on the curb behind the store in the dark in January, and I had been going in to buy children's Tylenol for Zoe, who had another fever. I almost walked past her. I almost did not see her at all in the dark. But I did see her, and what I saw was a teenage girl sitting alone in January weather who was not okay, and so I stopped. I sat on the curb with her for 45 minutes. I did not ask her what was wrong because she was not ready to say. I just sat there. I had Zoe in the carrier on my chest, Zoe at 6 months, bundled so thoroughly against the cold that only her face was visible, and Iris kept looking at Zoe, and at some point I said, "Her name is Zoe," and Iris said, "She's very little," and I said, "Yes," and we sat for a while longer. Eventually Iris started talking. I'm not going to tell you what she said because her story is hers, and she has shared it publicly in her own work and in her own words, and it is not mine to summarize. What I can tell you is that she was in crisis, and that I sat with her until the crisis passed. And then I went into CVS and got the Tylenol and came back out, and she was still there, and I asked her if she needed a ride, and she said yes, and I drove her home to her parents' house, which was 20 minutes away. Before she got out of the car, she said, "I don't know why you stopped." I said, "I saw you sitting in the dark in January. Nobody does that because everything is fine." She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "Thank you." She said it the way people say it when they mean something very large by it. I did not think about her again. I was 29, I had a baby with a fever, I had 3 jobs and no margin, and all of my attention was consumed by forward motion. I drove home and gave Zoe the Tylenol and sat next to her crib for 2 hours until the fever broke, and then I fell asleep in the chair. 12 years later, she walked across a conference room in Seattle and introduced herself and asked if she could write about me. She knew it was me immediately, she said. She had remembered me specifically, the woman with the baby in the carrier in the parking lot, who sat on the curb in the cold without being asked. She had thought about it, she told me many times in the intervening years, and she had carried it with her as a kind of fixed point. The proof that random kindness was real, that strangers stopped, that the world contained people who would sit with you in the dark without needing to understand why. When she found my name in the world of biomedical diagnostics, she had felt something she described to me as a kind of closing, a loop completing. She had already been thinking about writing the profile before Seattle. Seattle was how she confirmed it was really me. The profile she wrote was the best piece of journalism I have ever been the subject of. It was accurate and rigorous and unsentimental, and it described my work in terms that made it accessible without making it simple. It was the profile that changed the scale of how the world engaged with what I was doing. It was the profile that led to the book. And it existed because I stopped in a CVS parking lot at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in January and sat with a 17-year-old girl in the dark. I have thought about this many times. I have thought about what it means that the defining professional moment of my adult life, the moment that changed everything, that brought the book and the recognition and the full circle of visibility, was the downstream consequence of an act of kindness so small and so instinctive that I had forgotten it entirely. I had no memory of Iris Calloway until she said her name in that conference room. None. It had not registered as a significant event. It had registered as a Tuesday night in a parking lot in January. This is the thing that I keep coming back to. The architecture of a life is not always the grand choices. Sometimes, often, I think, it is the small ones, the ones made without calculation, the ones that cost you an hour in the cold when you have a fever and a baby and not enough sleep. The kindness that costs you something small can become the thing that changes everything. Not because the universe rewards goodness in some neat transactional way, because it doesn't, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something, but because people remember, people carry the things done for them, people sometimes get to come back. I did not know this when I sat down on that curb. I was just someone who saw a girl in the dark. I called my parents on Thursday night, from my living room in Columbus. Zoe was at the kitchen table doing homework. I sat in the chair by the window with a cup of tea and I called my mother first. She answered on the second ring. "Vivian," she said. Her voice was different, a different key than usual, lower, slower. "Hi, Mom." A long pause. "Zoe told you. She called me from your house, Tuesday." Another pause. "I didn't know," my mother said. "I want you to know that, I genuinely didn't know, you never told us any of it." "No," I said, "I didn't." "Why?" Her voice cracked slightly on the word, not a performance, a genuine break. "Why didn't you tell us, all these years, Vivian, why?" I thought about this for a moment. I had been thinking about it since Tuesday, rehearsing various versions of the answer, looking for the one that was most honest. I said, "Because I didn't need you to know in order to do it. And because, Mom, because every time I told you something good, you found a way to make it smaller. I didn't tell you because I couldn't afford to let you make it smaller. I needed to keep believing it was as large as it was." The silence on the phone was the longest silence I have ever heard on a telephone line. When my mother spoke again, her voice was very quiet. "We made you feel like that," she said. "Yes," I said, "sometimes." "I'm sorry," she said. And this was different from any apology my mother had ever given me, different in texture, different in weight. My mother was someone who apologized frequently for small things and never for large ones, which is another way of never apologizing at all. This was a large one. She knew it. I could hear it. "I know, Mom," I said, and I meant it. I was not performing forgiveness. I was not at the destination of forgiveness, which is a place I am not sure I have fully arrived at even now, because forgiveness is not a one-time event. It is a recurring practice. You do it again every time the old wound surfaces and surprises you. But in that moment I believed her apology, and I received it as real. "Your father wants to talk to you," she said. I heard the phone changing hands. I heard my father clear his throat. "Vivian," he said. "Dad." A pause. Harold Adler, in the long discipline of his life, had spoken his pain almost never. He had kept it as I had kept mine, in a box in a chest, sealed. I heard the sound of that seal giving. "I owe you an apology," he said. His voice had the flat, controlled quality of a man working very hard to maintain composure. "I owe you several. I am going to start with the one that matters most." A pause. "I have been wrong about you for a long time. I told myself a story about you that was not true, and I told that story to your daughter, and that was wrong. That was deeply wrong, and I am asking you to forgive me for it." I was quiet. "Your mother showed me the book," he said. "The memoir, we ordered it on that thing online, express delivery. I read most of it last night." Something moved in my chest at that, something I was not prepared for. My father reading my book. My father at his kitchen table in Harwick, reading the story I had written about the life I had lived in the years he had spent not knowing. "You wrote about the church fund," he said. His voice was barely audible. "You wrote about what it cost you, about the scholarship." "Yes," I said. "I didn't know that's what it cost you," he said. "I knew you deferred, I didn't know." He stopped, started again. "I told myself you chose to defer, that you preferred to stay. I told myself that for years and I let myself believe it." "Dad," I said, and then I stopped because there were too many things and none of them would come out in the right order. "I'm sorry," he said, and then with the deliberateness of a man who means every word. "I'm proud of you, Vivian. I don't know if that matters to you anymore after everything. I don't know if I have the right to be proud when it happened without me. But I am. I'm prouder than I know how to say." I looked at Zoe in the kitchen, bent over her homework, her pencil moving across the page. The lamp over the kitchen table made a circle of warm light around her. "It matters," I said. "It still matters." I don't know if that's the truth in every dimension. I think it's the truth in the dimension that counts, the one where you are sitting in your living room at 38 years old, still partly the girl who brought home straight A's and heard them land in silence, still partly the girl in the back of the police cruiser, still partly the woman on the floor of a hotel hallway in Seattle, crying about a word her father used without thinking. All of those versions of you exist simultaneously. You do not graduate from them, you just accumulate new ones on top. I told my father something I had never told him. I told him about Philip, the real version, not the softened version, not the complication with research attribution. I told him about the 11 months of investigation, about the retraction, about the year I lost. I told him about Zoe's first 18 months, the 3 jobs, the February eviction, the copy math in the emergency room waiting room. I told him about Professor Osai and Nora and the conference room in Pittsburgh, where I signed the term sheet. I told him about Iris Calloway in the parking lot and the phone call from Seattle 12 years later. My father listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause. Then he said, "You went through all of that alone." "Not entirely," I said. "I had people." "Not us," he said. "No," I said, "not you." Another long silence. Then, very quietly, "That is on me. The way you had to do it without us, that is on me." "It's on both of you," I said. "And it's on me too. I could have told you I made that choice." "You made that choice because we made you feel like you couldn't come to us," he said. He was not arguing, he was agreeing, acknowledging. "That's not your failure, that's ours." We talked for a long time, longer than my father and I have ever talked on the phone. Longer, I think, than my father and I have ever talked in a single conversation in my entire life. He asked me questions about the work, genuine questions, the kind that required him to have been paying attention to what I said. He asked about the model, about how it worked in a way he could understand, and I explained it with the patience I give to people I care about when they are genuinely trying to understand something difficult. He listened. He asked more questions. At some point he said, very quietly, 14,000 children. "At least," I said, "probably more now. The data is updated quarterly." A long pause. "Because of something you built?" "Yes. 14,000 kids got diagnosed faster," he said slowly, like he was putting something together. "Some of them, their whole lives might have gone differently, because of something you did." "That's the hope," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I built a hardware store," he said. "That's what I did with my life." There was something in his voice that I had never heard before. Not bitterness. Harold Adler was not a bitter man. It was more like a recognition, a quiet, late arrival at a truth he had been circling for decades without ever landing on it. He had wanted more than the hardware store. He had wanted it badly enough that the wanting had curdled into something corrosive, and then he had redirected that corrosion at me, at the person in front of him who was reaching for the things he had given up. He had called me a disappointment for 30 years, because I was the version of himself that hadn't stopped. I understood this in that moment with a clarity that arrived without bitterness, not because I had stopped being hurt by it, I had not, but because I could see it whole, finally, the full shape of it, and the full shape of anything is always less monstrous than the fragment. "You built a good store," I said. 3 generations, that's not nothing." "No," he agreed, "but it's not 14,000 kids." "Dad," I said, "what you built put me through 12 years of school with enough stability to dream. I'm not going to call that nothing." He didn't say anything. I heard him breathing. "Come visit us," I said. "Come to Columbus, bring Mom, I want to show you where I work. I want you to see Zoe's room, she has the same bookshelf I wanted as a kid, the one you said was impractical." A pause. "Come see what the life looks like." Another silence. "Then, you want us to come?" "I want you to come," I said. I don't know what I expected from him in that moment. An enthusiastic yes, a relief, some form of closure. What he said was, "I need to think about what it means to have been so wrong about someone for so long, Vivian. I need to sit with that. Not because I don't want to come, I do, but I want to come having done that sitting. Does that make sense?" It did. It made more sense than almost anything he had ever said to me. "Take your time," I said. The book came out 9 months after that phone call. What the Numbers Told Me is a memoir about biomedical research and early diagnostics, and the specific, grinding difficulty of building something important without adequate resources or support. It is also, between the lines, and sometimes directly on the lines, about what happens to extraordinary people in ordinary places, and what they do with themselves when the ordinary place cannot hold them. I did not write it as a revenge document or a self-vindication. I wrote it because Iris asked me to, because my editor Iris found in my story something she thought deserved to be told in full, and because I was finally old enough and stable enough to tell it without the telling costing me anything I couldn't afford to spend. I sent my parents copies before publication, advance copies the kind publishers produce for reviewers. I sent them with a note that said simply, "I thought you should read it before everyone else does. V." My mother called me after she finished it. She cried for most of the call. She said at the end, "I wish I had known you better." That sentence has stayed with me. Not "I wish I had been better," though I think she meant that too under the surface, but "I wish I had known you better," which is the more honest version, which acknowledges the gap as one of knowledge, of understanding, of the failure to look closely enough and long enough at someone who was right in front of her. I told her it was not too late to start. She said, "No, I suppose it isn't." My father read it more slowly, the way he approaches most things. He called me 6 weeks after I sent the copies, which I had given up expecting by then. "I finished it," he said. "What did you think?" A long pause. "I thought it was honest," he said, "more honest than I deserved." "What do you mean?" "The part about the scholarship," he said. "About what happened after. You could have made me the villain of that story. You didn't." "You're not the villain," I said. "You made a mistake and then you turned yourself in. Most people don't do the second part." "You made me," he said. "You sat across from me and made me." "You chose to do it," I said. "I only told you I thought you should." Another pause. "Vivian," he said, "I have to ask you something." "Okay." "The notebook," he said. "You found it in March. You held it for 11 months before I told you I was turning myself in. All that time you knew what I had done and you didn't tell anyone." "Yes." "Why?" he said. "You had every reason to. The church deserved to know. The community deserved to know. And you were going to the University of Michigan. The scholarship was already accepted. You could have turned me in and kept your future intact and no one would have blamed you." I thought about this. I had thought about it many times over the years. The honest answer was not the simple one. "Because you were my father," I said. "And I believed you when you said you would fix it. Maybe I shouldn't have, maybe that was naive, but I was 16 and I believed you, and then when you didn't fix it in time, I don't know. By then the decision had already been made and I didn't know how to unmake it." "You protected me," he said. "I tried to," I said. "It didn't work out the way I planned." A silence. Then, "You have spent your entire career thinking about how to get children the right diagnosis faster, to not let things go undetected for too long, to get the truth of what's happening in front of the right people as quickly as possible." He paused. "Do you think you spent your childhood learning what it costs to protect a lie?" I had not thought of it that way in exactly those terms, and the precision of it, coming from my father, this man of silences and hardware and few words, arriving at this late date with this particular insight, took my breath away. "Maybe," I said, "maybe that's part of it." "Then I gave you something," he said. "Even when I was being wrong, I gave you something." I didn't know how to respond to that. It was too large and too strange and too true to respond to quickly. "Come to Columbus," I said. "Bring Mom, come see the lab." "We'll come in the spring," he said, "when the store is quieter." They came in April. Harold and Beverly Adler drove to Columbus in my father's truck, which he has had for 14 years, and which he maintains with a devotion that I have begun to recognize as love expressed in the language available to him. They arrived on a Saturday morning, and Zoe was waiting at the door, and she ran to meet them on the front walk with a completeness of joy that I stood inside and watched through the window. I watched my father's face when Zoe reached him. I watched the way his arms came up, and the way she went into them like it was the most natural thing, like the 14-year-old girl who had read Wikipedia to him on his living room television, was also still the 2-year-old who had grabbed his thumb with both hands and looked up at him with complete trust. Continuity is astonishing, the way it persists beneath everything. My mother came inside first and stood in my hallway looking at my house, really looking, the way she looks at things when she is trying to memorize them, and then she looked at me and said, "You did this." "We did," I said. "Zoe too, she's the reason anything is where it is." "She organized your bookshelf," my mother said, looking at the living room. "Alphabetically by subject, then by author within subject," I said. "She's been doing it since she was 7, I can't find anything." My mother laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, not performed. I had not heard my mother laugh like that in years. My father came in last. He stood in the doorway and looked at me, and then he looked at the room, and then he walked over to the bookshelf that Zoe had organized. He stood in front of it for a long moment. My books were on the 3rd shelf, the copies of What the Numbers Told Me that I kept at home. He pulled one out and looked at it. The cover, the author photo, his daughter's name in the font that the publisher had chosen. He put it back carefully, the way you handle something that matters. "Show me the lab," he said. I showed him the lab. I showed him the server room and the diagnostic interface and the partnership documents from 3 of the hospitals currently running the platform. I showed him the dashboard that updated quarterly with outcome data from each hospital network. I showed him the number that was now, by the most recent update, not 14,000, but closer to 22,000 children diagnosed and receiving treatment who might have waited years longer in a different world. My father stood in front of the dashboard for a long time. Then he said very quietly to no one in particular, "She got it right." Nora came for dinner that evening. Nora, who had driven 3 hours from where she was now living to be there for this particular Saturday, because Nora does not miss significant events in the lives of people she loves. She came in the door and hugged my mother first. Nora hugs strangers, which has always struck me as the expression of a fundamental generosity of spirit, and my mother, who is not usually a hugger, let herself be hugged and then said, "You must be Nora. Vivian talks about you." "She talks about you too," Nora said, which was only partly a lie. Dinner was loud in a way my dinners are usually not. Zoe talked about school and about a book she was reading and about a science project she was planning that, she told my father with great seriousness, was going to require some hardware store expertise. My father's eyebrows went up. She explained the project. It involved building a physical model of a neural network from small metal connectors, and he asked specific questions about the gauge and the connectors and the load-bearing requirements, and they were off, speaking the language of physical assembly while the rest of us watched. "He's good with her," Nora said to me in the kitchen while we were getting dessert. "He always was," I said. "He just didn't know how to be good with me." Nora looked at me for a moment, and now. I thought about the phone call, about you went through all of that alone, about the dashboard and she got it right. "Now he's trying," I said. "That's more than I expected." "That's enough for a start," Nora said. After dessert, Zoe disappeared upstairs and came back with the physical copy of my Wikipedia page, which she had printed out and put in a sheet protector at some point, and had apparently been keeping in her room. She put it on the table in front of my father without comment. He picked it up. He read it, the same text Zoe had read to him on his television in November, but now held in his hands on paper. When he set it down, his eyes were bright in a way that was unfamiliar. He cleared his throat. "I owe you all an explanation," he said. He was looking at the table. "Not just an apology, an explanation." He paused. "I had ambitions when I was young, big ones. I wanted to study architecture. I was good at the spatial thinking of it. The design, I applied to a program in Cleveland." He stopped. No one spoke. "My father said no," he said. "He said the store needed me. He said an Adler ran the store. That was what Adlers did. I was 19. I didn't have what Vivian had. I didn't know how to fight for it." A long pause. "So I came home and I ran the store, and I loved the store eventually, but I spent a long time being angry about what I didn't get to try. And then I had a daughter who was going to get to try everything." He looked up at me. "And I didn't know how to want that for you without also mourning it for myself. So I told myself it wasn't real. I told myself you wouldn't make it. It was easier than cheering for someone who was going where I couldn't." The room was very quiet. "That's not an excuse," he said. "I'm not offering it as one. I'm offering it as the truth because I think you deserve the truth." I have thought about this confession many times since that dinner. I have thought about what it means that the worst thing done to me in my life was done by someone who was also, in his own way, a version of me, someone who wanted more than his world offered, who made a choice not to fight for it and spent decades regretting that choice in the only direction available. He pushed down instead of out, and I was the thing he pushed down against. I am not at peace with what he did. I want to be clear about that. I have not reached the place where his explanation dissolves the cost of what was lost, the scholarship, the years, the weight of the word disappointment, arriving in my daughter's phone call from a hotel hallway in Seattle. I do not think he deserves immunity from accountability in exchange for honesty. What I think is that honesty is where accountability has to begin, and that beginning is not nothing, especially after 38 years of silence. I looked at my father across the dinner table, in the warm light of my kitchen, in the house I had built without him, and I said, "Thank you for telling me." He nodded once, the specific nod of Harold Adler, the one I have known my whole life, the one that has landed on my report cards and my milestones and all the things I handed him hopping for more. This time it was different. This time there was something behind it that I had never seen there before. Not pride exactly, something more complex, something like wonder. My daughter reached across the table and put her hand over her grandfather's hand. He looked down at her hand, then he turned his over slowly and held it. The last thing I want to tell you is something Zoe said to me the night after my parents drove back to Harwick. We were sitting on the couch together, her head on my shoulder in the way she has done since she was small, and we were watching the kind of nature documentary my parents had been watching the night of the Wikipedia episode, and at some point she said quietly, "Do you think things will be different now?" "With Grandpa and Grandma," I said. "With all of it," she said, "with you and them, with the whole all of it." I thought about this carefully. I thought about what honesty required. "Some things will be different," I said. "We talked more in the last 6 months than we have in the last 10 years. That's real, that changes something." I paused. "But some things stay the same. Old patterns are hard to undo completely. I'll still manage the relationship carefully. I'll still get off the phone sometimes feeling heavier than I got on it. Those things won't disappear because of one dinner." She was quiet for a moment. "But it's better," she said. "Yes," I said, "it's better." "Because of the Wikipedia page," she said, and there was something in her voice that was very close to laughing. "Because of you," I said. "Because you told the truth to people who needed to hear it, and you did it gently like I asked, and that's a difficult thing that most adults can't manage. You did it at 14. She was quiet then. I was so scared. "I know," I said, "but you did it anyway." She looked up at me. "Is that what it's always like, doing the things you're scared of?" I thought about this. About the Ohio Young Scholars application, I finally mailed 3 weeks late with a shaking hand. About the confrontation at my father's kitchen table when I was 16. About the formal complaint I filed against Philip Whitmore with 2 lawyers watching me and my hands perfectly steady and my heart very loud. About sitting on a curb in a CVS parking lot in January because I saw a girl in the dark and stopped. About signing the term sheet. About the book proposal. About every single morning I got up when it would have been easier not to. "Yes," I said, "that's almost always what it's like." She nodded, like this was information she was filing. "Good," she said, "then I can handle it." I put my arm around her, and we watched the rest of the documentary in the comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough not to need to fill every quiet moment with words. Outside, Columbus was doing what Columbus does in the spring, rain that smells like mud and new grass, streetlights caught in the wet pavement. Somewhere on an interstate highway, Harold and Beverly Adler were driving back toward Harwick in a 14-year-old truck, through the Ohio dark, carrying something they hadn't carried when they left. I thought about 14,000 children, 22,000 now, children who were diagnosed faster, treated earlier, who had more time. I thought about a 16-year-old girl in a parking lot who had been seen in the dark. I thought about Nora on the phone the first time I told her about Johns Hopkins, screaming so loudly that strangers turned around. I thought about Professor Osai's ceramic teapot on a windowsill in Baltimore, and the specific quality of his attention when he read my work. I thought about Zoe at 14 with a Wikipedia page and a TV remote, and a careful, gentle, devastating kind of courage. You make a life from the materials you are given. You make it in spite of the materials sometimes. You make it because of the people who stop and sit with you in the dark, and because of the people you stop for, and because of the choices made without calculation in the moment, with no idea what they will cost or return. You make it imperfectly, incompletely, with damage in your architecture that will never fully repair. And then one day you look up from what you have made and you recognize it. It is a life, an actual, specific, unrepeatable life, yours with all its crookedness and all its grace. My daughter exhaled softly beside me, already half asleep, and I held her in the warm light of that ordinary room, and I thought, I got here. I actually got here. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Posted to R. True off my chest, verified long post. Thank you for reading. Edit 1 *. I didn't expect this many responses. Thank you, I'm reading every single one. Edit 2 *. Several people have asked about the book. It's real, it's out there. If you look for it, you'll find it. I'd rather not link it here because this post is about something more personal than promotion, and I want to keep it that way. Edit 3 *. Someone asked what I would say to people who are in the position I was in, the person whose family doesn't know what they've built, who is carrying their own worth privately, because they learned early not to hand it to people who would minimize it. I've been thinking about this since I saw the comment. Here is what I would say. You do not owe anyone proof of your worth, not your parents, not the town you came from, not the people who used the word disappointment about you like it was a fact and not a failure of imagination. You do not need their recognition to make your work real. The work is real whether they see it or not. The 22,000 children are real whether my father knows about them or not. And this is the part I had to learn at 38, which is later than I would have liked. There is a difference between not needing someone's recognition and permanently sealing yourself off from the possibility of it. I kept my accomplishments from my parents as a form of protection. That protection was real and necessary for a long time. But at some point it became a wall, and walls keep things out and also keep things in, and I was keeping myself in as much as I was keeping them out. The recognition my father gave me at that dinner table, the quiet wonder in his face at the dashboard, the "she got it right," it mattered to me. I will not pretend it didn't. I am almost 40 years old and my father's recognition still matters to me, and I have made my peace with the fact that this is not a weakness. It is a human thing. We are shaped by the people who formed us, and we carry that shaping all our lives, and the longing for certain kinds of love does not expire just because we get old enough to know better. What I'm saying is, let your Zoe show them the Wikipedia page, maybe not literally. Maybe the Wikipedia page is a conversation you have, or a truth you finally speak, or a door you open slightly after years of keeping it shut. Maybe it changes nothing and you walk away from the attempt knowing that you tried, and that is what you deserved from yourself. Maybe it changes something small. Maybe sometimes in the best version, it changes something large. You won't know until you try. And you are allowed to try. Vivian, 38, Columbus, Ohio.